Everyone's face is buried in their smartphones these days, but the popularity of these devices could be changing humanity in some very fundamental ways. Jean Twenge is a professor of psychology at San Diego State and the author of iGen, Why Today's Super-Connected Kids Are Growing Up Less Rebellious, More Tolerant, Less Happy, and Completely Unprepared for Adulthood. Jean, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Who are the iGen generation?
So iGen is those born roughly 1995 to 2012. So they're today's 5 to 22-year-olds, and they follow the millennial generation. So iGen is the first generation to grow up with smartphones as teens, to have that smartphone in their hand for their entire adolescence.
So a pretty provocative title to your article, and in this piece you said that in 2012 you noticed, quote, abrupt shifts in teen behaviors and emotional states, which you linked to the proliferation of smartphones reaching 50% of the population. Can you tell us more about that relationship?
Sure. So I've been researching generations for a long time, and most of the generational changes I used to see were things that built over time, over 10 or 20 years, and would build into bigger changes. Then around 2012, I started to see these much more sudden, large changes in a very short period of time, right around 2011 or 2012, when most Americans got smartphones. So then I started to look at the links between spending time online, spending time on smartphones, and mental health indicators among teenagers, and found that in these very large representative data sets, that those who spent more time on electronic devices and more time on social media were also those who were reporting higher levels of depression and anxiety and other factors linked with suicide risk.
And, I mean, to follow up on that, Jean, you write in the article, this is what you said, quote, it's not an exaggeration to describe iGen as being on the brink of the worst mental health crisis in decades. That's pretty alarming.
It is, and I think what people need to understand is that this evidence for mental health problems increasing comes from many, many different sources, and all very, very solid sources. So it's not that kids are more likely to seek treatment. These come from anonymous surveys. They come from government screening studies. They come from the suicide rate, which has gone up between 50% and by 3 times, depending on the age group, since 2007. So across many, many different sources and methods, we're seeing this very consistent rise in mental health issues with a really unprecedented change in such a short period of time.
And so you say that these shifts have also meant delays for foregoing altogether more traditional hallmarks of adolescence and adulthood. How much of that is because of this technology, and what are the other contributing factors?
So teens today, say high school seniors, are less likely than teens just 5 or 10 years ago to drive and have their driver's license, to work at a paying job, to date, go out without their parents, have sex, drink alcohol, all of these things that adults do and children don't. It used to be very common, almost universal, for 18-year-olds to do those things, and now it's less common. About 1 out of 4 high school seniors don't do those things at all. So many more of them are showing just slower development. That is trade-offs. There's good things and bad things to that. It's not all bad or all good. And it's partially due to smartphones, which allow more teens to stay at home and not have to do as many of those adult things. But there's many other cultural factors going on as well. Mostly just slower development because people live longer and start their families later, and people have fewer children and nurture them more carefully and expect them to be at home for longer and for their education to take longer. So there's a lot of cultural forces going into growing up more slowly.
Well, it's only been 10 years since the iPhone was introduced. Can we really anticipate the sort of sociological changes this kind of technology can bring from such a short period of time, relatively speaking?
Yeah, normally I would say, well, 10 years, we might see some generational shifts. We wouldn't really see the full picture for a few decades. That's what's so unusual about this transition between the millennials and iGen, is that it happened so quickly that these changes started to show up in the early 2000s and then really took off. And in just this 5 to 7 year period, we've seen these big changes, and that is very unusual. But that's also because think of how much our lives have changed, both teens and adults, since we've gotten smartphones. How we spend our time is radically different than it was not that long ago.
So what's the takeaway, you think, for parents of iGeneration kids?
Well, I think one main takeaway is a lot of parents are worried when their teens drive and hang out with their friends, and they're worried about their safety. And I understand that. I'm a parent too. But I think that they also have to worry that spending a lot of time on that smartphone is also dangerous, that it does not provide the in-person social interaction that teens really need for mental health. That screen time, they're spending so much time on screens that doesn't leave time for that in-person interaction. That is a bad formula for mental health. We need that face-to-face interaction for mental health, and screen time does not provide that. It doesn't provide the same protection against mental health issues.
Well, it's a fascinating piece, a lot of thought-provoking statistics. Jean Twenge, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.